buy a major capital goods like military spending, which many governments irrationally or unreasonably continue to do. Where do they borrow money? They borrow money from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. The IMF makes demands on countries. We will lend you the money, country X. We will lend you 25 million Haiti, which is a drop in the bucket even 20 years ago, on one condition. You have to accept Miami rice grown in the United States. Well, we need the money. Okay, we'll accept the Miami rice, even though we've banned it. Within 10 years, every rice grower in Haiti was out of business. They couldn't compete with the subsidized rice farmers in the United States. Out of business. 10 years later, Haitian children were eating mud cookies. The country was not growing its own food. One of the breadbaskets of Africa, Kenya, a net exporter of food for as long as we can remember, needed to borrow money.
That's right.
From the IMF. The IMF said, no problem. Kenya will lend you the money, but you better lower your tariff barriers to corn from Europe and the United States. Within 10 years, guess what? Kenya was a net importer of food, and conflicts within Kenya were occurring between groups competing for scarce food.
Amazing.
The example goes on and on. Venezuela, this is long before Chavez, needed some money. The government, plenty of oil, but the government just spent it frivolously, so they needed to borrow some money. No problem, Venezuela. You must raise the bus fare for people in the shanty towns who are commuting into work in the cities. Venezuelan president, no problem, we can do that. The people whose lives were affected realized, I won't be able to ride the bus and feed my family. There were huge riots. At least 300 people were killed in Venezuela in the late 1980s. All over the world there were riots. People understood the IMF was seizing control of their lives, their economies. Some places people won astonishing victories against large capital. In Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Peru, people stopped the privatization of water. The corporations were saying, oh, we can help you out. You need money? We'll buy your water for $2 billion. And the government said, oh, our water. We didn't even know it was worth anything. Sure, we'll sell you the water. But people knew better. They knew if the water was owned by a Belgian company, then poor native peoples in Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru would not be able to drink it. They could not afford to buy it. They stopped it. The mayors, the masses of the people, the working people, the miners, took over the cities, built barricades, had a democratic uprising within which they deliberated. They said, this water should belong to all of us. This is our water. That was democracy.
I see.
This form of people taking control of the streets to assert their right to deliberate about their future and to seize control of their own resources occurred with an Eros effect in East Asia in the 1980s. Again, it's not well known and no one that I know of has talked about it. I spent now several years researching it. But if you look at the simple facts, in 1980 the Gwangju uprising occurred, which paved the way to democracy in South Korea in 1987 through the 19-day June uprising. In 1986 in the Philippines, hundreds of thousands of people overthrew Ferdinand Marcos. In 1988 in Burma, hundreds of thousands of people went into the streets. Many were brutally killed, and the military consolidated its power. In 1989 in China, you had the Tiananmen Square. 1990 in Nepal, an absolute monarchy was overthrown and a constitutional monarchy replaced it. In 1992 in Thailand, a military coup d'etat was reversed, democratic government established, all through massive popular uprisings. This is a remarkable string of events.
That's right.
And again, it was people learning from each other, people's solidarity with each other, people in China saying, we saw it happen in the Philippines, And of course, if you think of the world in that period of time, it wasn't just East Asia. It was also Eastern Europe, where the Soviet Union and Soviet regimes were overthrown one after another in 89 and 90. The thing is, though, in typical Western fashion, the history of the European events is very well known, while those from Asia have just been excluded.
What? We have your work now.
Well, almost.
3 volumes. And it's going to be read quite widely. I promise, for example, myself, that I'll be teaching some of your books in my philosophy courses at Berklee College of Music.
Great.
A minor contribution. And now, I would like my viewers to have a flavor for how beautifully and powerfully George Katsafikas writes. What I'm going to do is highlight a few of his powerfully articulated thoughts on most of the themes that he has extemporaneously covered so lucidly, so clearly. So I thought that I should highlight a few of his writings, and then if we have time, we have about 10 minutes left, and of course I'm going to invite George. We're going to devote one particular program to discuss his 2-year-long project in Korea, which I know is going to be a powerful legacy for the future. A few of his complimentary and penetrating comments on his teacher, Herbert Marcuse. He writes, Marcuse's emphasis on human beings at the center of the universe, not just at the subjects, but simultaneously the objects of liberation, led him to ask whether there is a biological basis for freedom. Do human beings have an instinctual need for freedom? His answer was affirmative. For hundreds of years, Western progressive thinking posited the irrational as opposed to freedom. The Enlightenment, the French and American revolutions took as their goals increasing rationality and limiting irrationality, at least to the extent that we generally think of the irrational as meaning something evil and uncontrollable. By locating the movement for freedom in the instinctual structure, Marcuse was able to anticipate the coming of the green movement long before people began to talk about nature as our ally. When he talked about inner nature as a reservoir of revolutionary impulse, making a point subsequently taken up by the German Greens, he differed from Habermas, another major contemporary philosophical sociological writer, who regards the psychic as inner foreign territory. Moreover, in response to a feminist study group in which he took part, he extended his discussion to deal with feminism. He said that the radical subversion of values can never be the mere products of new social institutions. Quoting him, it must have its roots in the men and women who could build new institutions. Socialism, as a qualitatively different way of life, would not only use the productive forces for the reduction of alienated labor and labor time, but also for making life an end in itself, for the development of the senses and the intellect, for pacification of aggressiveness, the enjoyment of doing, for the emancipation of the senses and the intellect from the rationality of domination. Creative receptivity versus repressive productivity. In this context, the liberation of women would indeed appear at the antithesis to the performance principle, would indeed appear at the revolutionary function of the female in the reconstruction of society. Powerful, intelligent. Perhaps you could